Okay, guys. Well, look, we might kick off, and if anyone else joins in, they'll get let in as we go. So today's session, Module 7, is about how to undertake a meaningful risk assessment. And I think this is actually probably one of the most vital parts of looking at machinery, because all of us look at machinery in different ways, and all of us have different risk appetites when it comes to machinery. So in this session, we're going to explore why hazard ID is just so difficult, because it is. We're going to look at a three-method approach using a learning team, and we're going to reflect on your ability to look at risk from a machine perspective. So kicking off, why is hazard ID so difficult? What we're going to do is I'm going to play a recording from a Professor Drew Ray. And Drew Ray, for some of you, he's on the Safety of Work podcast series. But a number of years ago, he did his own podcast series called Disaster Cast. And I just want to play a little 3-4 minute segment from one of his podcasts where he talks about why hazard ID is such a problem. So here we go. And please let us know if you guys can't hear this. I have set it up to play. Sorry, that's embarrassing. Just bear with me for a second. Sorry, guys, just do this for you now.
Why is hazard ID so difficult? And this
is the basic management. A hazard is the basic management unit of system safety. Almost all safety activities throughout a system lifecycle have, as a precondition, a list of the hazards that need to be managed. For each hazard, we may undertake risk assessment, select mitigations, specify safety requirements, perform detailed causal analysis, verification and testing, and manage safety through life. All of this presupposes that we have identified the right set of hazards to begin with. Any hazards that we fail to identify create holes running right through our safety lifecycle. How often does this happen? A 2012 study by Neil Barton found that around 20% of major accidents can be blamed on failures of the hazard identification process. There's a subtle but important point to be made about this statistic though. It tells us what proportion of accidents involve poor hazard identification, but it doesn't actually tell us how often hazard identification is done badly. Other research, though, gives us this information. A 2006 study of construction projects found that less than 10% of hazard identifications were complete, with typically only 60 to 80% of the hazards which should have been identified actually being identified. This matches other research into particular hazard identification techniques, where individual methods find between 20 and 80% of all of the known hazards. Put simply, hazard identification is often done very badly, and bad hazard identification makes a significant contribution to actual accidents. To understand why completeness is such a problem for hazard identification, let's play a little game. I have in my hand a Mark V widget. Can you, in principle, tell me all of the hazards for this device? Probably not, because you don't know what a Mark V widget is. So I give you all of the design information for a Mark V widget. Can you now tell me all of the hazards? The answer is still no, because the hazards don't just come from what a Mark V widget is, but from how it is used. So I give you the widget, the design information, and a crystal ball which tells you exactly how and in what environments the Mark V widget will be operated and maintained. Can you now tell me all of the hazards? In principle, yes, you can. However, can you prove to me that your list of hazards is complete? There's the problem. Even if you have a perfect list of hazards, neither you nor anyone else can tell for sure whether the list is complete. Of course, it's easy enough to prove that the list is incomplete. We can do that simply by finding a hazard that isn't on the list. So, if we can never prove that we've identified all of the hazards, where does that leave us? We need to have confidence that our list of hazards is good enough. We'll end up using weasel words like reasonably complete or to the best of our knowledge. Our argument to back up these words will have three pillars: the competence of the team identifying the hazards, the methods that we used, and the information that fed into these methods.
Okay, so everyone's got the ability to, talking is now permitted. What did you find interesting from what Drew said? You can either drop that in the chat box or ask it as a question or connect in. So what was interesting about what Drew was saying? Because is this not a problem for us all about hazard ID?
I would say so.
Yeah. So basically, I'm just going to pop to the next slide. Just bear with me for a second. There were a couple of things that I've taken from what Drew has basically said, which has helped me, and I'm just going to share that with you. So if there is no list to tell you what all the hazards are, and no way of knowing if the list is complete, then what it says is that no one method can identify every hazard. And what he was saying is that using two or more approaches simply increases the capacity to identify more hazards. Now, the good news about machinery safety is the fact that we know that there are 7 major sources of harm that can happen on a machine around physical harm. So, of course, a checklist can be quite effective. And what Drew talked about is that your ability to identify those hazards come down to the information that you use, the methods that you use, and the ability of your people to actually do that. And what we're asking you to consider is that we want you to consider about working out what stakeholders need to be involved in that hazard ID process. And it's really important to be able to get a broad cross-section of people around that, around workers, suppliers, people to the cleaning, the maintenance, the reps, union reps, and management. And we'd like you to focus on each phase of the machine use. So think about machinery in your environment. You know, there's the setup element, there's the run element, there's the cleaning element, there's clearing jams, and the maintenance component. And when you identify when those hazards are present during those different phases of machines, that's when you need to go back and look at it from a task perspective, because that's what we're asking people to do on machines. They're there to perform tasks and activities. And the 3-method approach that we're going to use is around a checklist, some structured brainstorming, and our experience or gap analysis. So the checklist, the other week, we gave you guys a machinery safety checklist, which looks at the common types of hazardous situations that can arise. So we explored things like entanglement, we explored crushing, we explored striking. Your experience in gap analysis, that's going to come from the history around that machine. that history doesn't purely have to be about previous harms or previous incidents, that history can also include the maintenance and the reliability of that machine as well. But the big chunk of it is going to be around what we call the structured brainstorming, which is the learning team. And in that learning team around that machine, we're going to spend 95% of our effort understanding how work is done on that machine and only 5% solving, because we really want to focus on how workers are exposed to the different danger zones on that machine when performing their different jobs and tasks over those different modes of setup, run, clean, clear jams, and maintain. And a good way of doing that, and we're going to be providing this as handouts to you, is get the group to explore when they're performing that work on that machine across those modes. Get them to explore what can happen. Get them to explore how it can happen, why it can happen, and what is the likely impact. And the way that you explore that is you explore it through their storytelling. Every time I've done this, we learn so much from workers, because workers are the only people that really know how the machine is actually used. The what can happen and the how it can happen and the why it could happen simply gives us deeper context around the use of it. And the likely impact is really important when it comes to assessing risk. I don't know how you guys find it, but I hear quite often that people say to me that risk assessments are subjective. By following this approach of the what, the how, the why, and the likely impact or the likely harm, you actually reduce that risk of subjectivity, because the whole group has seen how the impact exists by looking at the nature of work itself. We've also provided to you a little Be Curious handout as well, which is if you struggle to ask questions, what are some of the questions that we could ask to start the conversations? So in these examples, we're saying, tell me about your work. Remember, we're exploring the work modes. So tell me about your work when you're setting this machine up for the day, or tell me about your work when you're having to clear jams on that machine. We want them to describe what does a good day look like, what does a bad day look like. We want them to describe where it's easy to make a mistake or what near misses we've had. We want them to explore what's the worst thing that could happen or what's the likely impact. But more importantly, we want them to share with us, what are we doing to stop that from happening? Is that enough? And what else should we do? And it's when we explore what are we doing to stop that from happening, that is when we find the disconnect between the controls the organization believe it has in place versus the controls that workers have to rely on to get the work done. And as part of that reflection process, you can also use a root cause model. And in that root cause model, we're not using the root cause to ask questions, we're using the root cause to seek clarification. So for example, I've got an example here of the environment. With that group, as they've shared how that machine operates, we could ask them or seek clarity with them around the need level of housekeeping, the need level around ventilation, noise, lighting, heat, cold, sun, or hydration. If you only ask these questions at the beginning of it, you're going to only get people to focus on those specific things. The whole idea of brainstorming is that we want people to go wide and deep. We're using root cause to seek clarification, where they haven't raised specific issues around that machine. And in the handouts that we're providing, we're giving you a list of questions based on that root cause model. This root cause model has come from ILO, International Labour Organization. But if you wanted to, for those people that love a good ICAM investigation, you could also use the PIPO model to do that as well. It's up to you. But if you want to use a generic root cause model, then one could be provided to support you in doing that. And all these things we've done, all the storytelling, getting the guys to go out and do the hazard checklist, getting them together and exploring all those things have now established all the context, all the scope and the criteria for the risk of that machine. And our next phase is then to actually undertake the risk assessment itself. And that is effectively where we are calculating risk. Now, at the end of the day, I've never been a fan of colours, numbers or labels, but I do accept that that is the reality of what we have to live in. That organisations want to know if it's low risk, medium risk or high risk. Organisations want to give things colours. Organisations like using numbers. When I think about machinery, what's really important is that we use a model that actually drives context. And the model we're using has been one that's been derived from the international standard ISO 12100 and has been used by organisations like PILS. We've simply changed the language and we're calling it HEAL. And HEAL is made up of 4 parts. The harm the machine can cause, the exposures of workers to the danger zones, the avoidance or the ability for a worker to avoid being in the line of fire, and the likelihood of an event actually occurring. So let's explore that. So with harm, it is a scale of acute being physical and chronic harm. So for the physical harm, it is a scale from everything from the tip of a finger to basically taking multiple lives. I know this is difficult, but the reality is in machinery, there's no such thing as minor first aid. That machine releases energy, that energy generates force, that force causes harm. So with a machine, we really need to know what part of the body can it harm and what is that level of harm based on what body part can it take. Exposure is made up of 4 parts, and these are really interesting conversations to be had. So exposure is based on the nature of the access. How do they get to the danger zone? In other words, there's a difference between being able to access a danger zone because someone's put some danger tape up versus accessing the danger zone because there's fixed barriers in place. How long people have to spend in that hazard zone, how many people need to be in that zone, and how often they have to be in that zone as well. Those are all the factors that make up exposure. And exposure is then referenced as being sort of constant, hourly, daily, weekly, or monthly. Avoidance. So this is about the avoidance of likelihood. And this is made up of the different persons who are exposed to the hazard, remembering that it's different for engineers doing repairs versus cleaners versus operators. We also have to consider how quickly the situation could lead to harm. That's really important when we're dealing with things like power, electricity, or dealing with pneumatics or hydraulics, the speed at which it could happen, the awareness of the risk, and the human ability to avoid or limit. Once again, anything above walking speed does not really give us much time to avoid. and that person's experience and knowledge. And avoidance is really broken into three components, and the risk assessment we've provided to you as a handout. It's seen as that they can avoid, that they could avoid, or they can't avoid. So you can imagine if you were standing in front of a lathe and there was no guard between you and the rotating part of the lathe and how that material can eject something from it, then you are in the line of fire. And the last component is likelihood of the event occurring. And likelihood can come from how reliable the machine has been, or its age, any accident history, or any history of damage to health. Likelihood I'm not terribly fussed about, because the way this model works is that it only gives a numbering process of up to 5 for each of the elements of exposure, avoidance, and likelihood. And it gives an element of up to 65 when it comes to harm. So even if your likelihood is highly subjective, that likelihood is not going to overburden the calculation of risk in that situation. Unlike traditional matrix or heat maps, where basically it's making up to half the equation. Right, so here we go. I'm going to do a little bit of an example. So when you assess risk on a machine, you need to assess it as seen. So what we have here is we have a rotating shaft on the machine covered by a fixed guard. The hazard of the rotating shaft is a worker becoming entangled. So you can see the couplings of that shaft, that creates an entanglement risk. So if I was to think about harm, exposure, avoidance, and likelihood, then depending on the speed of that shaft, the harm is going to be either breaking an arm or removing part of the arm. So it's relatively well known. The exposure of that, we need to know how often someone is present. If we look at that risk as seen, we have seen there is a fixed guard. So that fixed guard directly affects both avoidance and likelihood. So the worker can avoid being in the line of fire with that rotating shaft, and the likelihood of that worker reaching the danger zone is low because of the fixed guard. But the potential of that rotating shaft remains the same. So the guard itself, guards do not alter harm or exposure. And for a lot of people, that is one thing they really struggle with, is understanding that guarding does not alter harm or exposure. It's focusing on avoidance and likelihood. Here we go. So now we have a different type of machine. This is a machine that's used in commercial baking. And in this case, we've got a machine with an emergency stop, an interlocking mechanism with a guard that is interlocked. So what does that mean? The moment the guard is lifted, the machine is de-energized. So this is where harm is directly affected, because exposure remains the same. So exposure to the hazard is constant. Avoidance to it is they can avoid it because it's likely and there's low probability. But in this case, because the interlock removes the energy, If that energy is gone before the worker can reach the danger zone, then the harm is going to be on the minor end of the scale. The emergency stop has nothing to do with harm. The emergency stop, sorry, let me rephrase that. The emergency stop is a response mechanism once something has gone wrong. All it might do is it might reduce the amount of harm that's occurred, but it does not actually stop the harm from occurring. If I was to take a slightly more complex one here with a press brake, we now have a combination of guards, controls, shredder controls, and the light beam. So once again, if we looked at access to the rear of that machine, that guarding does not change harm. If we look around the front of the machine, that when a person is feeding in some material, the light beam is activated when the controls, the foot pedals are pressed. If any parts of the upper body, the arms or the head, tries to go into that danger zone, that light curtain will activate and remove energy from that machine. So the guards don't reduce harm. The light curtain can reduce harm if it can remove the energy within the amount of time. And that's consistent across that. So any questions from people around that? I know that's a lot to take on board today.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions if
Sure.
you're okay. So coming back to learning teams and group brainstorming, even though I agree with all of that, what suggestions or recommendations do you have in the sense of, if you think about operations management, especially when it comes to machinery safety and somebody's on the line and they've got a 24/7 production, there's this whole balance that needs to be done with people taking people off the line, basically losing time versus losing production. And then also the other part of that is there tends to be, not all, but a lot of workers do tend to feel that health and safety and management don't have their best interests at heart. So why do they need to participate? So it's like a two-part question. One is getting management to say, yes, I'll give you time to brainstorm with individuals. And number two, get the individuals to actually believe that you do have their best interests at heart. And I'll add a third part to that question. Are there any other options to still do the whole group brainstorming if you can't take people off the line, for example?
That's a multifaceted question. I think two things there, Wes, would be a lot of people still feel that safety is being done to them, not with them.
Yeah.
Okay. And the only way you can do safety with them is to get them involved. Okay. I would always suggest that we don't need to take workers necessarily off the line if we get the workers to do the checklist, which is very much context driven. So using that machinery checklist, they're being shown a series of different risks that exist on machines. They're giving context, and they're being asked to share how they work with that machine using that checklist. What I have found is that it creates that learning opportunity for the workers at that moment in time. And that can be done at the front line with the groups. Getting people into a room, that's really important, because if the objective here is for us to learn, learning has to be intentional. And the reason we want workers present is because workers actually understand real work. A supervisor or a manager is not as a representative of that work. They don't do the work.
Okay.
And what supervisors and managers are looking for are not the same things that workers are having to live with.
Correct.
So if the issue here is that hazard ID is poor, if we don't use worker engagement, participation and representation, we're not meeting the fundamental duty of the Act. So think of a learning team as a way of creating WEPR in the business.
Okay. Then thanks for that. Second question, thinking about small organizations out there, let's say small bakeries or small machine shops and stuff like that, that potentially, or I would assume a lot of them don't have a health and safety well-being resource. In your opinion, what could they do in regards to limiting the exposure, you know, especially with non-trade workers or non-trained workers?
Yeah, or I think once again, typically the owners of the small business are more hands-on. So they're more involved in the day-to-day operation of the business. So getting those owners to, for instance, to use that that checklist is a good way for the owners to see hazards on that machine they may have not seen before. So think about how do we start that curiosity component with those owners? Like everything else, small companies, they lack structure, but they are very agile. And I know with big companies, they have lots of structure and they lack agility. And I always find it interesting that small businesses want to create structure, big businesses want to become more agile.
Yeah.
So do you see some irony in that? So my view is that if we get those leaders to use that checklist to become curious on that machine, and they see things they haven't seen before, then they'll get workers involved.
Okay. Now, thanks for that. Last question from mine, and this is a pretty straightforward question. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to tell me this off the top of your head. I haven't been involved with this in quite some time, so hence the question. Thinking about, you know, light curtains and interlocking guards, what is the acceptable time delay before energy is removed?
Oh, so it's actually calculation.
Okay.
So the calculation is you need to measure the time it takes for energy being initiated, like an emergency stop being initiated, until the machine comes to a stop. So that's the first thing, you need to understand that. That amount of time, you then calculate based on the walking speed of a person, and that tells you the distance the light curtain needs to be away from the danger zone.
Okay. And is that the same for like the interlocking guard when you think about that mixer you showed?
Yeah, exactly. But the difference here is well, they're both initiating an emergency stop.
Yeah.
Yes, but if the thing is still spinning when it's lifted up, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That is a problem.
Yeah.
The
I'm sorry. I'm just trying. So from a light curtain, I understand that. So that's the walking speed. That's how far it needs to be away from. But when you're standing next to a mixer and you're lifting that guard, there's no distance from you to being close. Will it be the same calculation, or because it's just me trying to put my hand in there?
Oh no, it's straight up. If the interlock doesn't bring it to immediate stop,
yeah,
then there are other types of technology that doesn't allow it. There's what's called a pause, not pause. It basically means that you can't initiate the open until it's come to a stop.
Okay.
Based on time. In other words, you tell it you want to stop the machine, but that handle won't allow it to open until it's come to a stop.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, different. That's particularly with older machines. So there are different ways of doing it. Okay.
Yeah.
But the only time you can really use a light curtain, in my view, is when the fixed guard or the adjustable guard or the removable guard would interfere with the material.
Okay.
So that example of the press brake, the material has to be fed into the machine. difficult to do that with a guard in place.
Yeah.
For instance, you could create a slot in the guard to allow material to pass through. And then you need to think about how thick is that material, because if that material is more than 6 mil thick, then a finger can go in. Therefore, the slot would be further back. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So all these things are all based on the ergonomics of the human body.
Yeah.
I have seen light curtains that people can reach over and people can reach under. That's not good.
Yeah.
Okay, I've seen guards that you can reach around. I've seen fences or barriers or mesh too close to the hazard zone and a finger can get in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Understood. No, that's all from my side. Sorry guys for taking up all the time for questions, but feel free. You can ask a couple more questions if you like, or
yeah, no, happy to. Anyone can come off microphone, or they can do it in the chat box, or any other way they like. And while you're thinking about that, the session, our final session next week, is looking at common safe systems of work and my personal pet hate of lockout tagout as the default mechanism for everything.
Hey Brent, no
Hi,
questions. Just wanted to thank you for clarifying how the HEAL scores can be affected when applying different safeguards, like the guarding versus the interlocks and light curtains. I thought that was really helpful.
Yeah, people for some think that the guard removes the energy. It doesn't.
Just great to have that clarification. I could take it back to the teams because we're doing lots and lots of machinery risk assessments at the moment.
Oh, and engineers believe that guarding solves everything. Yeah, because whilst the hazard is present, and if the hazard has energy, then the potential for harm must exist. The guard is simply keeping the person a distance away, or the guard is containing the energy that gets released.
Exactly.
But doesn't stop its potential.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll have a knife fight with anyone who tells me different. It's all good.
I'll put a light curtain around you, mate.
You know, no, I hear it all the time, and I just shake my head. A bit like people, they assess machinery and they assess that like with nothing fitted, and I say no, you have to assess it with its current design operation.
Yeah.
Okay, that's how you assess it.
Yeah.
Not with everything removed.
Yeah. No, I get that. I understand it completely. Well, if there's no other questions, guys, then I just want to say thank you for Brent yet again for the time investment, and thank you for everybody coming along as well. I know it's a time investment for yourself as well. I really appreciate you coming along. There's one final session left, and that is on the 5th of April. Make sure that you are registered for that. And then I will be sending out the link to today's webinar that will be on our YouTube channel, as well as all the handouts Brent has mentioned in today's webinar. If I don't get to speak to you soon, then stay safe, guys. Thank you for coming along, and I'll see you next time. See you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.